Good morning and welcome to the third day of our TiEcon 2020-21. We've had some exciting sessions and most of you have heard some great speakers in the Global Connect track. This session that we're going to do is something that everybody is interested in. And we're going to actually talk about the art of investing to create unicorns. And we're so excited to have two very accomplished people to come and talk about this. My first guest here is going to be James Mawson, and James is going to moderate the session. James has been in the private equity space, in the media and the private equity space for many years. He was part of Private Equity News, which was owned by Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. He's been an investor there. He's done a number of startups. He's been part of the BBC series. He's spoken about venture investing and has spoken at many conferences. So very accomplished person on this subject. And I thank you, James, for joining us here. James is going to be speaking to Mr. Roland Manger, and Roland is a co-founder and partner at Earlybird. Earlybird is a venture fund that invests in startups, and as the name goes, I think they go in pretty early. One of their most accomplished startups that they've invested in is UiPath, and I think Roland was a seed investor in UiPath, which has gone on to become one of the biggest unicorns from Europe. So we're really excited to have both of them here, and I'm going to hand it over to James to take the session forward and talk to Roland and bring out all those wonderful insights in how to create a unicorn while investing. Thank you. Over to you, James.
Wonderful. Thank you for that kind introduction, Vijay. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be back at TiEcon and to have the honor of interviewing and hearing the insights firsthand from Roland Manger from Earlybird. Can I just start, Roland? Obviously, great pleasure to welcome you to TiEcon this year. A decade ago, 3/4 of early venture money by value was in Silicon Valley. Now, 3/4 is outside. Many of the best performing funds or deals are coming from more emerging regions such as Europe. Roland, can you explain how you and Earlybird saw the potential and what it took to achieve success with your Digital East fund, which is probably the best performing ever in Europe, and deals such as UiPath, from whose CEO Daniel Dines we heard earlier?
Well, first of all, thank you, TiEcon, and thank you, James, for having me on. It's a real pleasure and honor. So this will be a bit of a longer story, but first allow me to talk briefly about our personal motivations when we started Earlybird Digital East. I guess Jem, Dan, Everett, and I were all at the point in our lives where we wanted to start something new. So in my particular case, my 50th birthday was fast approaching, and I was asking myself if I wanted to continue to stay in my Western European comfort zone, or have one more go at something slightly more risky and more exciting. So when I met Evren and Jem through an investment in Peak Games in Istanbul, and a bit later my partner Dan, I felt those guys could be my partners in crime. We quickly noticed that large institutional investors like EBRD and IFC that have a development finance mandate have already been active investing in Central and Eastern Europe, in later stage investments and buyouts, but they were just becoming ready to commit to venture capital in the region. So they were looking for fund managers to back. And then all four of us from very different vantage points saw that some of the smartest people in our region were getting more tuned into the global entrepreneurship culture. They weren't looking for examples or people to look for in their own countries in Istanbul or Warsaw. They were looking for role models in London and San Francisco. So while startups in the West were all complaining about not finding enough engineers and developers, about skyrocketing salaries, our Eastern European founders had an access to large pools of well-educated people, graduates that were eager to work for a startup. That startup would be their ticket to a more exciting and more Western kind of career, rather than working for the local insurance company in Sofia or Bucharest. So while we noticed more and more fundable founders and teams, there was still very little early stage capital finding its way east. And we felt that was our opportunity. So to your question, what it took to achieve success, basically, it really took to achieve success like everywhere in venture capital. First you have to find brilliant founders. I mean, I guess that's the most critical ingredient. You actually have to be able to convince them to take your money and then help them where there's a need, but most of all, get out of the way, right? I mean, where they don't need you. And you're laughing, right? But having worked with in different constellations with different investors, often that's a problem, that investors are sort of overbearing and think they have to prove they can add value. Sure, I mean, if you can add value where there's a need, great. But if you're good and fortunate enough to pick the right founders, most of the time you don't have to do that. So, but I guess there's one difference to this process compared to US and Western Europe. In our region, great founders are often not as polished and apparently self-confident, right? I mean, if you get across people that can present themselves well, obviously initial communication is easier. But they're highly self-aware, and they prefer to work on what they do best, which is building great products and avoiding the limelight. So it's even more important to spend time and get to know them really, to look beyond the veneer, if you will, and otherwise you miss them. You won't find them. And there's another challenge, and that's sort of related to part of the opportunity, that not so much capital is there. Since there's little capital available in our region, and founders aren't comfortable in the limelight, raising further early stage capital, let's say beyond our first seed round, remains difficult. So that, as opposed to the US, where there's a lot of money going around and presentable investors are looking for it. So that's why it's good to have deep pockets. So it was very important for us to have a relatively large first fund to be able to keep our powder dry, and so we can fund our companies to the point where it becomes really obvious what their potential is. And by the way, that was the case for UiPath. When we first invested, we immediately wanted to syndicate this with US VCs. We showed it to more than 20 VCs. Nobody was interested. And even a year later, when we wanted to do, let's say, an early A round, same thing again. Yeah, it took us quite a while. In our seed round, eventually we turned to Credo in the Czech Republic to join us. And in the next round, we actually just did it ourselves. And only after some really visible success, Excel finally joined. So I think that's an important piece of learning. If you're doing that in our part of the world or in other parts of the world, have deep pockets and keep your conviction. And finally, I think it's also important, but that's a general comment, to have a split personality in a way. I mean, if you're investing in early stages, there's not much to be seen, right? Let alone be proven. The risks are still enormous. So on the one hand, a critical analytical mind is necessary to identify those risks and manage them, right? But with only a critical mind, you would never actually make an investment, right? So there needs to be a side to you that uses imagination and can be excited about opportunities that present themselves, and by which itself alone would burn through the fund's capital in no time, right, with meager results. So I guess those almost contradicting sides of destructive analytical, if you will, and constructive creative are necessary. So you can find the right balance. But I'm talking far too long. So I guess that's sort of how I would frame the question or the answer.
Fascinating insights, Roland. There's a lot to sort of perhaps unpick and sort of dive down into that, about how to raise the funds in the first place, and then be able to work with those entrepreneurs. It's a really difficult task that you've had to do, you and your colleagues, but enormous success. So I'm interested now, what do you think the potential is now compared to what it was maybe 5 or 10 years ago? And will you think returns in Eastern Europe will revert more to the venture mean with competition, or continue to outperform?
Well, I think market forces will even things out, and quite frankly, that's what the founders in our region deserve, right? More capital at better terms. I'm not saying we have bad terms, but the point is, we all operate in a market, and there is an advantage for us, being there with very few competitors. But the good thing is, the more and more lighthouses like UiPath we will have, the better the situation will come. So more successes will cause a growing number of investors to reconsider their assumptions of our region and their preconceived notions, which there are a lot, and hence create an adequate supply of capital eventually. However, I don't think that's going to happen overnight. So even if you sort of intellectually realize that there's an opportunity, you will need team members on the ground that are ready and able to find and convince these unpolished founders, right? I mean, they're not coming to you, you have to find them. Sure, some of them will come to you, but certainly Daniel wasn't even thinking about raising capital when we met him. And then, further up the chain, your senior partners and your investment committee members will have to adjust some of their preconceived notions and learned patterns for their decision making, right? I mean, they might, be tuned more into a more communicative, polished entrepreneur personality. So when they're confronted with these, very, very ambitious but unpolished founders, there may be a problem. I mean, just to give you an anecdote, when Daniel was first presenting at one of our investor conferences, one of our LPs came to me and said, I'm glad you only invested $1 million there. Right, and that that again gives you the next point, which is your LPs also need to stand behind you on that kind of strategy. So it requires the whole chain, the whole capital chain, to readjust itself, and that's why you won't see this happen overnight.
Interesting, fascinating. And so so that sort of wave of capital has come in, but presumably you already have the advantages, you have the success stories and everything with that. So what motivates you now, though, if you've achieved such success? This was the entrepreneurial story when you were going towards your 50th birthday. So what motivates you to achieve the dreams of all VCs now you've achieved it?
Yeah, at first, as you said, I was looking for a way to avoid a midlife crisis. But now I can recognize much better how much opportunity our region still holds for Earlybird Digital East. And I'm really motivated by that, right? I mean, I'm still in business, I'm excited. And now that the opportunity is proven, there's even more motivation. So in a sense, the unicorn success with Peak Games in 2020 and the Decacon success with the UiPath IPO in 2021 are major, but just hopefully early milestones for us. Now, we cannot predict the magnitude of potential outcomes. I mean, this one was absolutely huge, and we don't see how big the others will be. But I would still like to see a broader wave of startups from our part of the world becoming big, and hopefully see more of them maybe stay independent, go public, and become lighthouses for further generations of founders. Much like some of the founders and charter members of TiEcon have, right? I mean, they're giving back to the community and setting an example. And I think in our region we need that as well. But there's still another thing that's always excited me. I'm excited like a kid in a candy store about the amazing ideas and technologies and products that I get to see earlier than other people, and they're really stimulating my imagination. So it's often mind-blowing what we get to see. So that's keeping the fun in my job.
That's fascinating. Can you give some examples? 1 or 2 examples?
Yeah, sure. Let me, of course, UiPath was one of them. I keep going back to UiPath, but that had a certain impact on me. But that was a while ago. So let me give you a more recent example. A few weeks ago, we made a small seed investment in a company called Anari AI in Novi Sad, Serbia. So the team's previous activity was in the global AI community. The CEO was an organizer of a European regional AI event, a regular event, but he was also tuned into Silicon Valley and into Asia. And while they were at this, they realized that AI, machine learning, and associated computing needs were actually evolving much faster than general purpose CPU or GPU technology that where it's run on, right? So on the one end, you have this sort of great focus on pushing AI and ML that creates a lot of advances, and that has to run on a technology that's now in a much more mature stage, and eventually, though, is not moving as fast. So there's a disconnect, right? And there will be more and more an issue around: do we have the performance to actually do those things that we now can do conceptually? So what other alternatives are there, right? You could create application-specific chips, right, where you don't have to have a general solution for everything, but you construct it in a way that it works particularly well for your problem, and that gives you more performance. But that, creating a chip, I think everybody knows, takes a long time and a lot of money. And once you created a specific chip, if you want to change your algorithm, it's not optimal anymore. So there are, of course, flexible architectures. One of them is field programmable gate arrays, FPGAs. They're even hosted by AWS now, right? So you don't have to buy them; you can just access them. But to tune them to your problem, you still need to be a hardware engineer. You still really need to be in the nitty-gritty, and to make those really useful for broad-based general solutions has been a problem that nobody has solved. So instead, Anari is taking a very vertical approach. They are picking a few commercially viable areas from artificial intelligence and machine learning, and by focusing on that, they are able to abstract the way you can program an FPGA to a very high level, which effectively means you can use a high-level language like Python to create your chip. So imagine that, right? You don't need hardware engineers anymore, but you have software engineers that may have a particular AI problem that they want to solve, and they can create their own chip that does that. So with all of the innovation that could probably set free, and all the sort of non-linear gains that are possible, that really got me excited.
It's fascinating, actually. Well, it's wonderful. In the final minute, I suppose, Roland, can you just give perhaps something on the opposite side? Those are the exciting opportunities. What worries you most from a personal or professional basis? And are there any areas that TiEcon Diaspora can perhaps help with? Yeah.
So I think I'm worried about some of the events around the pandemic, like everyone else here. So I'm not going to focus on that. I do believe that the cycles of growth and consolidation are not permanently suspended, even though we've been in an up cycle for a long time. There will be down cycle, and it may be as harsh as some of the ones that I've seen in my career over the last 25 years. So investors will be more risk averse. It will affect the supply of VC and hence of startups. But also in previous cycles, entrepreneurs have shown to be resourceful. The best of them have always found ways to make their companies survive and thrive. So I'm not worried about entrepreneurship and innovation. I'm generally optimistic about that. However, what worries me most is sort of what's around all of us. The world in which we live in. On a global level, I'm particularly worried about increased geopolitical tension between the US and China, right? And I think many people will share that. And about general tendencies, not just within the US and China, to reverse course on globalization. Yeah. We've seen some of that triggered by the pandemic. Yeah, I mean, it's right to have some corrections to the system of international division of labor and supply chains, to have no critical single point of failure in pharmaceuticals or semiconductors. But I'm worried about overreaction of politicians and some business leaders that are claiming to put their countries first and strive for autarky, right? That's pretty far. So that will decrease global wealth, leave fewer means for economic development. But the consequences could even be worse. And I promise that's my last point. economic interdependence, not independence, but interdependence is a great way to make countries and their leaders control their aggression and foster pragmatic policies, right? Because they need each other economically. I don't want to imagine what happens if this is going away, right? If people really think about autarky. So to come to my conclusion, that's why I'm glad about international forums like this one here, TiEcon, where we're all resisting temptations to retreat to our shells, but instead really realize the value of communication and cooperation, right? So I think we have to keep this up. So thank you for letting me participate.
Well, thank you for all your great work, Roland, in fostering some of that internationalization, particularly in Eastern Europe. So been a great pleasure to hear your insights, and thank you to TiEcon for the opportunity.